Hey, this is Amir. In this video, we're going to talk about reading for the main idea. And this is a great strategy if you have trouble with time on the SAT reading section. I actually had trouble with running out of time when I was prepping for the SAT way back in the day. I went to high school back in the 1930s, so I'm like 106 years old, but I look like I'm 30, so it's pretty sweet. Anyways, enough about me. Let's talk about this passage. So actually, before we talk about this passage, let's just talk about a little bit of background. When reading SAT passages, many of us have a tendency to read very slowly and carefully to make sure we understand every little detail. We don't want anything to get past us. The problem with this is reading carefully to absorb everything can take up a lot of time, and thus we can run out of time on the reading section. So that's why it makes sense to ignore the details and just focus on the main idea. So now, I'm not saying never read for the details. There's a time and place to look at the details, but that's not on the initial read. So when we start answering the actual questions, that's when we can refer to the passage and look at the details. But for right now, we just want to read for the main idea. So let's take a look at this. It's the same passage that we split up using the piece-by-piece strategy, and we'll practice reading for the main idea. So in lines 1 through 17, where are the details that we can sort of ignore? Basically, the first sentence tells us a lot, and that's really the main idea. When Major Pendleton Talbot of Mobile, Alabama, and his daughter, Miss Lydia Talbot, came to Washington to reside, they selected for a boarding place a house that stood 50. Okay, so basically, Major Talbot and his daughter Lydia rented a house. That's it. All of this, pretty much the entire piece, lines 1 through 17, goes on with description of the house. We don't really need to focus on this. It was one of the quietest avenues. It was an old-fashioned brick building with a portico upheld by blah, 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 blah. So all we need to know about the gist of this is Major Talbot and his daughter rented a house. And then it goes on describing the house. And then right here at the end, lines 15, 16, 17, it says the major's finishing up a book. So he's writing a book. Great. All right, let's go to the next piece, lines 18 through 41. What's the main idea here? Well, in this first part, lines 18 through 28, it's really a description of Major Talbot as a Southern gentleman and being from the old South. We don't really need to get into all of this detail here. And then it goes on to talk about his clothes. Do we need to really focus on exactly everything, like his frock coat swept the floor, the garment was a surprise even to Washington. So he wore some funky clothes, great. And then in the end, it says that people in the boarding house liked Major Talbot. So really, all of this can be boiled down to description of Major Talbot being from the South, a Southern gentleman, his unique clothes, and that people in the boarding house like Major Talbot. That's it. We don't have to focus on all these details. Let's go to the next piece, lines 42 through 63. Again, it's continuing with Major Talbot in terms of how he liked to tell the young department clerks stories. And it goes on to say how he can make the clerks uncomfortable and because he was intimidating. We don't really need to read every single word about the traditions and history. So he told them a story, he told stories, they were intimidated by him. And then this section, lines 51 through, 63, is talking about mainly Henry Hopkins Hargreaves. So he's another tenant in this boarding house. All we have to know is, okay, this is the description of Henry Hopkins Hargreaves. And then finally, in the last piece, lines 64 through 90, goes on about Henry Hopkins Hargreaves. We can just sort of note that, okay, Hargreaves worked as a comedian, and he was a fan of Major Talbot's stories. So again, it's really talking about a lot about how he was a comedian and wanted to succeed at comedy, blah, 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 blah. Just right now, he was a comedian, worked as a comedian, and he really was a fan of Major Talbot. And then it goes on to say, to talk about Major Talbot, that Major Talbot at first wasn't a big fan of Hargraves, but then was like, yeah, this guy's pretty cool. So that's basically the essence of the strategy. So to summarize, reading for the main idea is a great strategy, especially for those of us that are slow readers. Just be careful not to overly focus on the minute details and think big picture.